Hello ECA students. I hope that you're having an enjoyable beginning to your school year so far. My name is Josh Dykstra, and you're probably wondering why there's this strange guy who's making a video for you to show in your class. And so I just wanted to give you a little bit of background on myself before I get started on what I wanted to talk to you about today. So I am actually a former ECA teacher. I taught in the high school from 2003 to 2007. So if my mental math is correct, some of you who are juniors or seniors may have been in school at the time that I was there. Maybe, I'm not sure. So ECA is still a place that is dear to my heart, and so when I got the opportunity to speak to some of these issues of faith and science and have it shown to you guys, it was an opportunity that I thought would be well worth the time. And so after I left ECA, I ended up pursuing chemistry as an occupation, and so now I work as a chemist in the pharmaceutical industry. So I'm a real in the trenches scientist, so to speak, and I work for a company called Cambrix in Colorado in the United States. And so with that being said, I wanted to give a short presentation to you guys today about the intersection of faith and science and what that means for us as Christians, as well as just kind of in our everyday lives. So those are the issues that I wanted to get into today, as far as how do we go about thinking about faith and science, and what are some of the different perspectives that people have on these topics. So there are four different views that I have to present to you today about faith and science, of commonly held views that people have about these two different important topics. So the first viewpoint is a rejection of faith in favor of science. So this is a really commonly held viewpoint among atheists, who basically hold that we don't need faith anymore, that science has essentially supplanted faith in our lives. And this comes out of a period called the Enlightenment, which happened in the 1600s and 1700s, and what that sought to do was to use human reason to explain everything in the world. Some of the negative consequences is that people started to think that the only things that were real were the things that you could see and that you could touch. Science was the basis for that, because science deals with things that we can see and touch. So by necessity, God is not somebody that we can see and touch. So these specific ideas from the Enlightenment would reject faith on the basis that we can't see it, we can't touch it, we can't prove it scientifically. And so that can then be carried forward if you go forward about 100 years from the Enlightenment to the advent of Darwinism, and that's kind of the next logical step, is that we now have a naturalistic, quote-unquote, explanation for the origin of life, which was not available before. And so after that point, you see a lot of people who are just claiming that faith is no longer necessary because we can explain everything that needs to be explained through science. So as a Christian, this is obviously not something that we're going to believe in, and actually the Bible speaks to this kind of thinking. In the book of Romans, chapter 1, verses 18 and following, it says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools." And that sounds a lot like today's modern atheists. They claim to be wise. They claim to the fact that science tells us everything that we need to know, but in fact what the Bible says is that in claiming to be wise, it's actually a form of foolishness, because they are rejecting the evidence from nature that God actually does exist. And so by taking the naturalistic perspective that we can learn everything that we need to know through science, it's actually perverting what God has made and what God intended to be as evidence for His existence and turning it on its head and saying, no, actually, this is all evidence that God does not exist. So the second perspective I wanted to discuss is the exact opposite. So it's the rejection of science in favor of faith. And this is unfortunately common among many Christians today who essentially think that that the Bible teaches us everything that we need to know, and that therefore we don't need modern science. And so the things of science are not really necessary. We don't need to know about all these issues because the Bible teaches us what we need to know, and therefore they reject modern science as not really having anything to offer to them. This is also a perspective that I would argue is not particularly biblical, and I believe that for a number of reasons. First one is that in our modern society, it's just simply not practical. Unless you're planning on going and living under a rock in some island with nobody else around, you're going to encounter modern science. The very fact that I can record this video in Colorado, United States, upload it to some server, which then allows you to download it and view it in Bogota, Colombia, within half an hour of me recording it, is a testament to the power of modern science. And I don't believe that God created all of these things for us to just ignore them or to suggest that they're not, that we don't need them. And instead I believe that we can use science and we can use technology in a way that is good and that furthers God's kingdom without rejecting it. So the second reason I don't think that we should be rejecting science is because God calls us to be in the world, not of the world. And so by rejecting science, we are essentially not being in the world. So the third perspective that I wanted to share is a very, very commonly held one, and in fact I think it's probably one of the most commonly held perspectives. And that's that faith and science are not in conflict actually, because they just occupy completely different spheres in people's lives. So in other words, science is the way that we study the natural world. Science has to do with reason. Whereas faith has to do with things like what is the meaning of life and has to do with morality. And so this perspective would hold that there is no conflict, that people who claim to be people of faith, that's great, they can get their meaning, they can get their morality, they can do what they want to do, but on the other hand, people who are in science, then they can study science, they can use reason and study the natural world, but the two do not really intersect. And there's a couple of reasons why I don't think that this perspective is quite right. I would argue that there are many areas in which faith and science actually do intersect, and that we do have to think through these issues, and we can't just kind of push it off to the side and say, you do your thing and I'll do my thing, and we can just both coexist in the same place without having to ever come into conflict. I don't think that that's actually a practical position to take. If we're going to engage our culture, we have to engage these issues, we have to think through them carefully and not just shove it off to the side and say, well, you can do what you want and I'll do what I want. I don't think that that's something that is actually a position that we can hold for the long term. And one of the areas in which I believe that faith and science actually do intersect strongly is that I believe that faith and morality can restrain science. So there are many examples from history where science has gone awry and has done things that most people would consider to be immoral. So for instance, during World War II, the Nazis did experiments, medical experiments on Jews. And many of these were dangerous experiments that failed and the Jews died. And so I don't think there's too many people here who would argue that those were okay, that was an acceptable thing to do. But from the perspective of science, if it advanced the science, then okay, well maybe it was the right thing to do. Even though a small percentage of people died, if they could come up with a cure to some disease that was otherwise unavailable, maybe it would be okay. Whereas the Christian would reject that perspective and say that all human life is sacred, and so those experiments are not acceptable. And I think thankfully that opinion would be in the mainstream even today. A more modern example that just came out recently in the last few months was there was a Chinese scientist who claimed to be the first person to ever clone a human embryo. And this was kind of heralded, but the scientific community even said, well, this is not really okay, and there's a moral issue with this because these types of experiments, if you actually start making human beings out of these clones, there's a whole host of potential issues that go along with that. So from the fact that the experiments might fail and you would have a bunch of people who are born with large amounts of defects and potentially short lifespans, to the fact that we just don't know exactly how these experiments would turn out, and you could end up affecting people's lives, to the long-term consequences of what would happen if we actually were successful in this and we started cloning people. That's not necessarily something that would be considered a positive result in many ways. And so morality necessarily plays into this picture of, you know, how do we go about thinking about something like human cloning? Is that something that would be acceptable or unacceptable? Science cannot answer that question. Science can only say, this is the experiment that was done, here were the results. That's what science is. That's what science does, is it observes the natural world and it gives a result, but it cannot interpret that result and give a meaning to that result, or a value judgment as to whether that result was good or bad. Science just says, here was the experiment, here was the result. So for the example of human cloning, here was the experiment, here was the result. I made this human clone, but whether that was a good idea or a bad idea is outside the realm of science. And so that is where faith can come into play. And if as Christians, if we are not engaging the culture in saying, no, this is a bad idea, this is immoral, this is not something that we should do, then we're leaving it to the culture to interpret and to say, oh, well, actually, this is okay because it's going to save such and such number of lives. A similar thing occurred about 15 years ago when stem cells were a big issue in the research community, and as to whether we could use human stem cells and human embryos to conduct research. And the reason that it was controversial is because if you have a human embryo and you do this research on it, then the embryo dies. And so if you believe, as many Christians do, that the embryo is a human life, then it is immoral to kill that embryo, even if it's going to help to cure a disease that would not otherwise have a cure. And so those were very tricky issues that had to be sorted through and worked out within both the community of faith as well as the overall culture as a whole. And so these areas, and these are just a few of the areas where faith and science do intersect, and where you have to look to faith and to morality in order to interpret your science and to say, okay, this is a good idea or a bad idea. And so this idea that we can just put science over here, faith over here, they're in different spheres, they don't intersect, everything's good, I don't think that that's actually a position that you can hold. So the final perspective that I wanted to share, which is the one that I believe is an integration of faith and science. And so these would hold that although there are apparent conflicts between faith and science, ultimately we can have a both-and approach, that I can believe in science and I can also believe in the Bible and I can also be a person of faith, and these two are two that I can hold at the same time. And so when we think about what does it mean for a Christian to actually do science or to be a scientist, I think that we start out with the fact that God created the world. And so God is a creative God who made everything that we can see. And so God made science. The natural laws that are followed, God invented those. God made those up. When God created people, He gave people a couple of instructions. He said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. And so what does it actually mean to subdue the earth? Well, it means to take charge of it, to take control over it, to explore it, to find out more about it. So that is science. That's what science is part of subduing the earth. And so I think it's a natural part of the human heart and the human expression to want to subdue the earth, to want to understand what is actually going on in this creation that God gave us. God made a beautiful creation. Let's try to understand it. I think that's a very natural impulse that people have. And so with that, God also created people in His own image. And so we are made in the image of God, and as a result of that, we are also blessed with the ability to be creative and to reason just like God has the ability to be creative and reason. And a big part of that creativity and reason is exploring the natural world and understanding what it is that God actually gave us. So the bottom line for that is that I believe that by understanding the creation, it is helping you to understand the Creator. And I think that that's one of the things that I love about science and that actually drew me into the field of science, was realizing how incredibly intricate and complex and awesome the creation is. That is true whether we start to look at like the macro scale, like planets and stars and how God put them all together, and even the Earth and the way that it's made, and the distance from the sun, and the size of the Earth, and the rotation speed, and the tilt of the Earth, and all these different factors that go into the Earth that have to be perfectly balanced to support human life. And if any one of those factors was off, then human life would cease to exist. And God made it perfectly. He created the perfect world so that we could live in it. And that is just awesome to me. And it just makes me think, what a great God that we have, who could think up and be so creative and so able to figure out and to understand the math involved in these things, and the science to be able to come up with all these ideas about how this would all work together and how complex it is, and yet how God fit it all together in one unified whole that people didn't have any clue about for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And now we get to start uncovering it and unpacking it and unwrapping the layers of the onion that God made for us and how incredible the creation is. Another example of this is something very, very simple that we all take for granted all the time, and that's light. So that was in fact the first thing that God made. God made light. Now, we usually will gloss over that because it's not typically the most interesting of all of the creation. We tend to skip forward to the really cool stuff like, people and animals and plants and all this kind of thing. But actually, light is an incredibly, incredibly complex thing. And for a long time, people thought that they understood light, that they understood how it worked. In the late 1800s, scientists began to study light, and they realized that it actually is really kind of weird. Most things in nature have one of two ways that they behave. They either behave as a particle or they behave as a wave. And so initially, it was thought that light traveled in waves, but then there was some evidence that light actually acted as a particle in some cases. But then there was other evidence that showed that light actually does act as a particle or a wave. And so the question was, is it a particle? Is it a wave? We don't know. And so there were all these different experiments that were done in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And it was determined ultimately that light, when it is traveling through space, it acts as a wave, and when it interacts with matter, it acts as a particle. But who would have thought that something that's so seemingly simple can be so complex? And then you add in the fact that light is actually made up of all these different wavelengths that can do different things, and it can be split into the rainbow. And if you have super low wavelength light or electromagnetic radiation, you can make it into radio waves. If you have super narrow, it can be harmful, but you could use it for X-rays. All this stuff, everything in here is from one simple thing from the Bible, which is that God created light. Now, if your mind goes anywhere like mine, that's just like, whoa, what an awesome, incredible creator God that we have, that would be able to think of all these things that just blow the human mind, that we cannot even understand. Even after doing research and research and research, there are still things about it that people do not, and probably maybe never will, understand. So another example of this type of thing is cells. So cells are something that were discovered originally when light microscopes were originally invented. Cells were discovered and they looked like these little blobs, and animal cells, you could tell the difference between an animal cell and a plant cell, and it looked like the cells had this dark spot called a nucleus. But that was pretty much it, and so because cells looked fairly simple, people actually assumed that they were simple, that living organisms were fairly simple, that they were just made up of these cells, and the cells would divide and reproduce, and that's it. We're good to go. We understand biology. And then people started to actually be able to look inside the cell and to do a little bit of a deeper dive into it. And what they realized was that cells are not just made up of a blob with a nucleus in it, but there's all these little mini parts to them. And then the parts have parts, and they can be subdivided. And then that's just the main components of the cell. Then that's not even including things like proteins and the hormones and the carbohydrates, the lipids, the different components that go into living organisms. And they interact in a way that is harmonious, that works together, and that simply cannot be reproduced by human results at this time. In chemistry even, we have a hard time running reactions under the same conditions that would be used in a cell. So cells are made up of water primarily, and they have a certain pH, and they have certain characteristics, and they have all these different components that could possibly react. And in chemistry, a lot of the time, we struggle to make a reaction work. A single thing in there, one single chemical in there, trying to make it do one single thing, and the human body does thousands of these simultaneously, constantly, all day long, every day, without any real effort. It just happens. And so, once again, that's something that just makes me, at least, fall on my face and say, wow, this is an awesome, awesome God that could create all these things. With cells, as with pretty much every area in science, the more that you actually learn about something, a particular area, the more you realize how actually complex it is. And so each area of study then opens up a whole new can of worms, a new rabbit hole to travel down, which is why science seemingly never ends, because there's always something else to explore. It never is just, oh, well, we figured that out. Well, maybe there is an area that we figured out and that we think we fully understand at this time. But guess what? There's always something else that goes with that you're like, oh, well, what about this? Or what about this? What about this observation or this thing that we don't quite understand? And that's how science can continue to progress, is that there's always new questions that need to be answered. So the way that I like to think about it is that there are essentially infinite questions because it relates to an infinite God. And we can learn about God through His creation. So what are some of the things that we can learn about God that I've already mentioned? Number one, God, His intelligence. To be able to create all of these things in a way that's coherent and that makes sense and that works together in harmony is an incredibly, incredibly, incredibly high degree of intelligence. Secondly, creativity. Just the creative mind to be able to think of all these things that are just so beyond the scope of what normally a person would be able to think of. It's just unbelievable. We have two pieces of artwork. So one was created by a master artist, and one was created by a 2-year-old. And we could put these up here, and it is not terribly difficult to tell which one is which. Why is that? Why can you immediately spot which one was created by a 2-year-old and which one was created by a master artist? Because you make inferences about the creator based on the creation. So we can see that the master artist created with skill, with intention, with technique, with practice, and with having to work hard at his craft so that he could create something that is beautiful. Whereas my 2-year-old here, who made this drawing, there was not a whole lot of thought to it. He just kind of scribbled something down. There wasn't a whole lot of intention to it. There wasn't a lot of skill involved. So when we look at the creation that God left for us, we can ask ourselves, what type of creation is it? Is it more like the 2-year-old's work of art, or is it more like the master artist's work of art? And I think it's pretty obvious if we actually look carefully which one it is. So I want to thank you for listening to this presentation, and I hope that you enjoyed it, and I hope it was thought-provoking for you, and your teacher will be following up with some discussion questions as well. Thank you very much.